As we finish exploring the history of Israel's kings, we are introduced to the second most important event of the Old Testament, the Exile, the Exodus being the first. We used the books of Kings and Chronicles to explore these stories. As you read, you probably saw that the history of Israel during this time went from bad to worse. One of the pivotal events of Israel's history is the division of Israel into two separate nations. Your reading in 1 Kings chapter 12 tells the heart of the story. After the death of King Solomon, the son of David, the people of Israel came to recognize Solomon's son, Rehoboam, as king. But they came with a complaint. They were angry at Solomon for being too hard on them. Seeking a change, they asked Rehoboam to ease their forced labor and oppression before they would confirm him as king. To drive home their point, they brought with them Jeroboam, a military leader who had rebelled against Solomon. Perhaps they did this to threaten Rehoboam with potential rebellion if he did not agree. In 1 Kings chapter 12, we see a classic depiction of how leadership is modeled in the Bible. Rehoboam seeks the advice of two groups of people. The wise elders tell him that proper leadership is servant leadership. The friends who grew up with him counsel that leadership is simply power, and Rehoboam listens to his young friends. Unfortunately, this decision had disastrous consequences. A majority of the people of Israel rebelled against Rehoboam and made Jeroboam their king. The period following the rebellion of the Israelites is called the divided kingdom. There are 12 tribes in Israel, and 10 of these tribes reject Rehoboam and make Jeroboam their king. They keep the name Israel and they live in the northern half of the land. To simplify the confusion, this group is often referred to as the Northern Kingdom. The two tribes that remain faithful to Rehoboam take the name Judah and occupy the southern half of the land. This group is often referred to as the Southern Kingdom. Before the division, there is only one Israel, but after the division, there are two nations, Israel and Judah. Although there are two Israels, or two different groups of God's people, the story of the Old Testament emphasizes that this divided nation is really united in poor leadership, sinfulness, and ultimately in exile. The book of Kings tells us the history of both kingdoms. As you read, you may have noticed a few patterns. One pattern is how it continually dates the reign of one king and compares it to another king. The book of Kings does this to emphasize how these two nations are divided, but are still united as one people. Another important pattern in the book of Kings is the religious evaluation of the kings. A king's quality was based upon how faithful he was to God. In the book of Kings, very few kings received a good evaluation. The kings of the northern kingdom were seen as bad, as were most of the kings of the southern kingdom. What was the key problem? Idolatry. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 15 verse 14, the phrase, "they did not remove the high places," shows how idolatry is supported by the kings in both the northern and southern kingdoms. The Israelites had a continuous problem with idolatry while they were ruled by kings. In this book, and in other Old Testament books, the Israelites and their kings repeatedly turned to the worship of other gods, such as Baal, Molech, and Ishtar. The book of Kings makes clear that idolatry was not just a problem of the kings, but also a problem of the people. Turning to the book of Chronicles, we read the history of Israel's kings from a different perspective. In some sense, you find much of the same storyline in the books of Samuel and Kings. However, the uniqueness of 1st and 2nd Chronicles lies in the way it is told. The best way to explore this is to think about the positive evaluation of King David at the end of 1st Chronicles. Compare this telling to the accounts of David in the book of Samuel. While used by God, the story of David in Samuel is one of a very flawed individual. However, in the book of Chronicles, it is a very positive story. The book of Chronicles has a few key things that are emphasized in its stories. First, it is very supportive of the southern kingdom and opposed to the northern kingdom. It makes no mention of the kings or people of the northern kingdom. Second, the book of Chronicles affirms the rule of David and his son Solomon. You see this emphasis in a couple of ways. Saul, the first king of Israel, is barely mentioned. Second, the book of Chronicles avoids negative stories about David and Solomon altogether. They do not mention David's living with the Philistines or his adultery with Bathsheba. They don't mention his murder of Uriah, his encounter with the prophet Nathan, the revolts against David, or Solomon's murder of his brothers. Third, the book of Chronicles emphasizes the importance of the temple and worship at the temple. Prior to entering the Promised Land, the Israelites' main place of worship was called the tabernacle. It was an ornate tent that moved with the people and was where the priest served. After Israel became a nation, the temple was a permanent version of the tabernacle in Jerusalem. The book of Chronicles emphasizes the importance of the temple by spending a lot of time telling about the planning for and construction of the temple. It also highlights its importance by focusing on particular kings who do religious reform, kings who emphasize the importance of the temple. The books of Kings and Chronicles also introduce us to the exile. The exile is the second most important event of the Old Testament, after the Exodus. Before we look at how the books of Kings and Chronicles explore the exile, we need to make sure we understand it. The exile refers to the period of 70 years when the Babylonians conquered the Israelites and forcibly took them from the land, moving them elsewhere. Think of it as forced relocation. Many groups before and after have used this method to keep people from rebelling. When people are separated from their homes and forced to build a new life, they often lose the energy to rebel. In this case, the Israelites were moved to Babylon, which is located around modern-day Iraq. Another important thing to note is who the exile refers to. In this case, it's the southern kingdom. By the time of the exile, around 586 BC, the northern kingdom had already been conquered by the Assyrians, who took the Israelites away. Those 10 tribes became integrated into the societies they were moved to. So, the exile only applied to the southern kingdom, which would eventually return, as we will see in a future session. Knowing a little more about the exile helps shed light on why it took place. In accounts recorded in both Kings and Chronicles, the cause of the exile was not military defeat. The ultimate cause was a lack of faithfulness to God. The people's continued idolatry, denial of the prophets of God, and their continued mocking of God had consequences. The result was God removing his protective hand and allowing the Assyrians and then the Babylonians to conquer the Israelites in their land. This was so important to the Jews that they put this account at the end of the Hebrew Bible, our modern-day Old Testament. This reminds later generations of the importance of faithfulness to God and the consequences of idolatry. Evidently, this reminder worked after the exile because idolatry ceased to be a problem in the Old Testament. In the next session, we will explore the experiences of the Israelites in exile. For now, let's look at the relational questions and discover how this Old Testament scripture applies to your life.